I thought, that's okay. If you're good enough, you will overcome them with your great discovery, and then nobody will question you. And I was wrong. It took me 15 years to be certain that all other women were discriminated against, and I still couldn't conclude it for myself. It took another 5, so it took 20 years. And I got to say that the moment I realized it was the worst moment of the whole thing. You realized you'd been fooling yourself in a way nobody had ever seen you as a full participant in this system that you loved and had given your life to in a way and felt was your life, that people saw you somehow differently.
I'm Katie Hafner. Welcome to Lost Women of Science Conversations, where we talk with people who have discovered and celebrated female scientists in books, poetry, film, and the visual arts. Today we're discussing the book The Exceptions, Nancy Hopkins, MIT, and the Fight for Women in Science by Kate Zernike. The book tells the story of Nancy Hopkins, a molecular biologist who discovered her love of science at 19 in 1963. She earned her PhD at Harvard, trained with 2 pioneers in the field, and in the 1970s and 80s, she made big contributions to cancer genetics, broadening our understanding of retroviruses, enhancers, and their role in cancer biology. Later, in 1989, Nancy changed her focus to zebrafish, which allowed her to ask and answer questions about genetics and development. And yet, for all those achievements, Nancy faced significant challenges. Throughout her career, she was often sidelined by her male colleagues. By the 1990s, she began to fight against the disparities. And she did that with the same precision with which she conducted her research. She focused on gathering data, and she went so far as to measure by hand the size of her lab and those of her male peers. And when she realized that other female faculty members at MIT were encountering obstacles not unlike hers, she led their fight for gender equity. Finally, in 1996, a committee which Nancy chaired submitted a landmark report documenting widespread discrimination against female faculty at MIT. We're talking today with Kate Zernike, who was at the Boston Globe in 1999 and was the first to report about Nancy's fight. Kate's now a reporter at the New York Times, and joining her is Nancy Hopkins herself. Hosting the conversation is Juliana Lemure. She's a scientist by training with a PhD in molecular biology and microbiology. She now works in science communication and is the deputy editor-in-chief at Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, or GEN.
Hi, I'm Juliana Lemure, and I'm so excited to chat today with Nancy Hopkins and Kate Zernike. Kate, let me start with you. So the book is about Nancy and the fight for women in science, but you actually start the story much earlier with Nancy's childhood in New York City and her journey from high school to college at Radcliffe. Why did you feel it was important to retrace so much of her early life before we get to the big headlines?
Oh, it's a good question. First of all, Nancy is such a compelling character, so I wanted to tell as much as possible about her. I think when I broke the story in 1999 for the Globe, the women at MIT were talking about unconscious bias, which was a new idea at the time. But by the time I came back to write the book, and I started reporting it in 2018, people had really heard about unconscious bias and in many cases kind of dismissed it and thought it didn't really happen or it wasn't really a thing. So I felt that to tell the story and to show people how it works and the toll it takes on women or people, you had to tell this very personal story about someone. So I wanted people to, I sort of fell in love with the character of Nancy too, but I wanted people to understand where she came from. But I also think there's so much about Nancy's childhood that tells who she is later on. For instance, there's a story about how the switchboard operator in the apartment building where she grew up got very frustrated one night because all the girls from her private school from Spence would be calling Nancy asking for math homework help. And she had to take like 34 messages from all the girls in the class who wanted Nancy to do their math homework. When I mentioned this to my book editor, she said that's such a generous impulse. And I think there was so much about her childhood that went to Nancy's generosity, but also her determination that she had to do the right thing. So, for instance, when she gets caught doing the math homework, the teacher asks her about it and she lies about it. And she feels terrible that she's lied. And she goes back and she has to tell the truth the next morning, which I think, again, just sort of goes to the kind of character we're dealing with.
Nancy, and now I'm going to turn to you, why you persisted for so long in science after so many challenges. Can you tell us a little bit about when you first fell in love with science and what it is about science that you love so much?
Wow, what a question. What a wonderful question. Listening to both of you does remind me of these things, which no one doesn't think about very often. I still remember those girls and who didn't love math the way I did. And I mean, oh my gosh, think what they were missing. I know, I always felt, solving math problems was a little bit like eating candy. There was something about it. It was so rewarding. It was just such pleasure to do it. And I thought, once they see this, they're going to enjoy it too. So the science itself, yeah. I have asked myself this question, why did you stick it out so long? And it was you captured it. I think that's a tribute to Kate. I think she then captured people who love science, really love it.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, I've looked hard for other things that are as exciting or as mind-blowing as science. But at the end of the day, it's almost a belief system. And it just really appeals. It's mine. It's the one that works for me. When I had the problems, well, at first I thought the privilege of being able to be a scientist at a place like Harvard or MIT where I worked in Cold Spring. I mean, I realized how incredibly fortunate anyone was who got to do that. And so I used to think, God, what if you'd been born in some place where there isn't such science? You wouldn't even know it existed. And so to be able to be there, I felt was a real privilege. So I felt sorry for everybody else who wasn't there.
But tell the story about how you fell in love with science, because I think it is a real moment for you. And I think the passion of that moment and all that science was going to uncover for you, I think, when you talk about that lecture at Radcliffe.
Oh, well, yes, I had liked science all the way through from school. But I had then gone to college in an era when women were expected to get a very good education, meet their husband when they were in college, marry soon after, have children, and work perhaps, but not have such a concentrated career as a man would in that generation at that time. And I think a lot of young people who go to college, you're suddenly free. You're thinking about your life and what you're going to do with your life. And I wasn't completely convinced that this was the right path even for me, somehow. Was I going to be happy living in the suburbs with 2 children and a dog? I don't know. And so I thought maybe I should go to medical school. I had all the requirements done except biology. I signed up for the thing, and I walk innocently into this class, and I hear a lecture by James D. Watson, the man who discovered the structure of DNA. And I walk in as one person, and I walk out as a different person, and that is the meaning of life. He's just told us the secret of life, and for me it was the meaning of my own life. And suddenly everything fell into place. Oh, whoa, these molecular biologists, they're going to figure out everything about living creatures, including humans. We're going to understand diseases and why people are the way they are and how the world works. And, it was a real bombshell.
I think, scientists do just get bitten by a bug, don't we?
We do. I mean, I suppose people do for many things. I think some people,
sure.
It's music. Some people, it's playing tennis, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But for me, it was just one moment like that, 1 hour. Wow, that's it. Done.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you did face during your career. For example, and for people who read the book know, during your recommendation for tenure, despite being your department's top choice, your name was surreptitiously moved down the list at the request of a prominent colleague. You were excluded from departmental meetings, did not receive the same opportunities to apply for funding, or they were actively hidden from you. You had the credit for a discovery stolen by a male scientist, and you were not given the same amount of lab space as your colleagues. So looking at some of these, was there one that was more difficult for you, or the biggest one that was the turning point for you?
That also is a very interesting question and a bit hard to answer, because I think it is the cumulative impact of these things over years that turned me into an activist for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think for each one of them, you try to find a solution. When you can't, you navigate around it. You keep going. You find another one. Another thing happens. You do the same thing. But I think the other part of it is when I look back, people say, why did it take you so long to figure this out? Everybody else knew. What was your problem? It was a belief that science really is a meritocracy. And if you make an important enough discovery, it won't matter what other people think of you or how they treat you. You will be acknowledged for what you do. It's just the nature of science. And I think that belief is so strongly embedded in the occupation culturally. And I think the other thing was that, yes, if you complained, other people who felt as I did would see you as a whiner and also as somebody who wasn't good enough, because if you were good enough, you wouldn't have to complain. You would just get on with it. So you were silenced and also very insecure in whether you were right in your judgment of whether it was fair. So you were always looking to see, well, did that really happen because I was a woman? But finally, it took me 20 years. It took me 15 years to be certain that all other women were discriminated against, and I still couldn't conclude it for myself. It took another 5, so it took 20 years. And I got to say that the moment I realized it was the worst moment of the whole thing. You realized you'd been fooling yourself in a way nobody had ever seen you as a full participant in this system that you loved and had given your life to in a way and felt was your life, that people saw you somehow differently. And so that moment, I think people resist it. I think it's easier to think that maybe you really aren't good enough than it is to think that people don't see you fairly. If it's really something as deep as they don't see women the same way they see their male colleagues, there's nothing you can do about it.
Right. You give up a little control over your own destiny to say, oh, it's just the system. Whereas if you believe it's the meritocracy, you can just keep pushing on, which is what I think most women did.
Everybody's different. What is it that bothers you? For me, it was the realization that, they never really saw me as one of them. That was the one that was a killer. But I became an activist because I ran out of energy to try to leap over one more problem and just keep going. I just couldn't do it any longer. I just ran out of energy. And it was so ridiculous. And this was the thing about this teaching of a class. I've been told that I couldn't teach undergraduates because MIT students didn't believe scientific information spoken by a woman. And I'd said, well, of course, everyone knows that. I had accepted it as normal because as soon as somebody said it, I realized, of course, it's true. I was able to see that women were so under-respected that students couldn't respect them enough. And so they were afraid to put an important course into the hands of a woman for fear the students would not be able to respect them. Anyway, many years later, I took on the teaching of a course that other people generally didn't want to teach. And then I was pushed out of that because it became valuable. And so I was pushed out and I said, that's it, I'm done. I can't keep doing this any longer. No, done.
Because to your mind and to all the feedback you were getting was that the course was going really well.
The course was going really well, and it was more than that. I'd taken this course that nobody else wanted, really, because it wasn't good for it wasn't something that benefited you in a way that certain classes do. If you teach graduate students, that's very good for your lab, because then they come to your lab. You get to find out who's the good students, and you can recruit them to your lab, and so forth. And here was a class that wasn't going to be valuable. It was a service, really, and I was happy to do it because I was just excited about it. And I had done a previous course on which this one was based. And then I had to even look at the data. Yeah, I had to look at the student evaluations to make sure, no, I am just as good as everybody else and better. And yet I'm still being pushed out. I said, I just can't do this anymore. I just can't.
Wow. And instead of just, not doing it anymore, though, you decided to take action?
Well, again, by then I was 50 years old. Suddenly I had a career. It was my life. And I was running a lab. I loved my work, my scientific research at the time, and had a wonderful lab. And so I really wanted to fix the problem. And I didn't know how to fix it. And how do you fix a problem like this? And I ran through all the standard things people think about. You go to the different administrators at different levels and you talk to them. And they all listened politely and said, well, I don't know, that might have happened. Again, how could they understand it? It took me 20 years to figure out how could they understand from a single incident or one or two incidents what you're talking about. And then I thought of suing, but I knew that if you sued an institution, you would fight for years and it would destroy you as well as maybe bother them, but probably not much. And I didn't want to do that. And I didn't know what to do. And finally, I wrote a letter to the president of MIT saying, I thought, this is my last shot. I'm going to the top. And I said, you've got a problem here because I've discovered this is systemic, invisible, I believe, discrimination that people don't intend, but it's very damaging. And I decided I had better show it to another person before I sent it to him. And I chose a woman. And I had not talked to other women really seriously about this for the reasons I told you. They're afraid that other people will think you're whining. I knew they were discriminated against. I didn't think they knew. This is so interesting. Anyway, I got up my courage and I asked this woman, I just respected her so much, Mary Lou Pardue, and she was such a successful scientist and she was dignified and impressive in every way. And I asked her to read my letter to the president of MIT and see whether she thought it was okay that I should send it to him. And she read it, and then she said she wanted to sign it. She agreed with everything I said, and that moment literally changed my life, changed ultimately MIT. And thanks to Kate Zernike, got out and changed the world, I guess you'd say, in a funny way.
Nancy, I want to get back to that point that you just were talking about when Mary Lou offered to sign the letter. But Kate, what I want to ask you is, let's go back to 1999 for a second. When you had that first phone call with Nancy and began to learn the story, what stood out to you?
Oh, a couple of things. One, just the sheer fact that MIT was going to admit that it discriminated against the women on its faculty. And that alone, Nancy likes to hear me say this, that in my business is what we call a man bites dog story. It was not what anyone was expecting. The second, and in some ways more interesting thing to me, was that these women had, the reason the president of MIT was going to acknowledge this was that the women had gathered all the data and written this report to show how they were discriminated against, and they had numbers. And I come from, on my father's side, a long background of scientists, and I think I just thought, wow, they did what scientists do. They had leaned into their science, and I thought that was so clever. Those were sort of the two selling points, but then it really was that they were talking about a different kind of discrimination. And I think this even persists today a little bit. We think that discrimination, for it really to be discrimination, it has to be a door shut in your face. You have to basically be told, you can't have this because you're a woman, because you're a person of color, because you're gay, whatever it is. And what they were saying was, no, this is what happens after the door is open. That's what matters. That's what shapes careers. And it's the subtle bias, and it's the things, many times, as Nancy said, many times it was unintentional. But it's insidious and it's stubborn. And in some ways, again, I think this is still true, it's harder to fight than the more egregious examples of discrimination, certainly of gender discrimination, because people aren't sure it's real and the women themselves aren't sure it's real. So I think it was that these women had done what scientists do. I thought they were incredibly ingenious, but also that they were illuminating a new kind of discrimination, which I was just starting my own reporting career. It was not something I'd thought about, but everything they said made sense. And I could say, oh, yes, I see exactly how that happens.
And to get back to the collecting data part and speaking science, Nancy, do you think that that's one of the reasons why this story had the success that it did? Because you were speaking the same language because you were fluent in that language.
Yes, absolutely. I think that was a huge part of it. We were so lucky. I mean, MIT is a science and engineering school, and we were scientists and also later soon engineers. So we really were talking the same language. I've thought about that. What if it had been, poets? Would it have worked out? I hope so, but I'm not sure. Just go back to the thing about Mary Lou. Mary Lou was the first woman ever in the School of Science at MIT elected to the National Academy of Sciences. And so that's kind of our stamp of approval. If you're elected to the National Academy of Sciences, you're good enough for MIT. So maybe Nancy Hopkins wasn't good enough for MIT, but Mary Lou Pardue was, okay. I respected her enormously. I knew how good she was, and yet I also knew that she had been discriminated against. The fact that she knew it that's the new thing I learned. And this woman who had this stamp of approval from the world, really, as a scientist, had now agreed to it. The world just shifted in that moment. It really did. She was looking at me, and I think the same thing was going through her head. And she was looking at me, and I think it was this thing of, oh, my goodness. There's two of us who agree about this. We looked at each other and said, you don't suppose there could be more? Because you realize the power of two. Suppose you had more. So it really was an extraordinary thing. And can you imagine, here we are sitting here in this room talking to each other about this. But to me, it's as if it happened yesterday, that moment.
Yeah.
It changed my life. But that it could have this impact, after all, when it became public, because it did speak to the truth and helped people to understand it. I think that was the other thing, because I had gone to these very good men, wonderful men. So we had some wonderful administrators. They listened, but they couldn't understand it. And I don't blame them. I can see why they had trouble understanding it. They just thought it's a difficult person you ran into. It was the circumstances of that particular experience that was the reason. And there always was another reason you could ascribe it to. So it really required this group coming together and with the data.
And I think the data was important, but also it was the combination of the data and the stories, right? Because another thing about scientists, same is true of journalists, we look for patterns, right? So there's this moment in the book where Nancy and Mary Lou decide they're going to talk to all these other women at MIT and see if they feel the same way. And there's this moment after the women come together that they go and they speak to the dean of science, who's a man. And he says, there's 6 of these women sitting around his conference table. And he says to me later, he knew them all individually. And had any one of them come to him individually and given the same story, he would have said, oh, well, it's this department head, or it's this grant that she lost out on, or she's mad about this, or she's always been difficult, whatever. But seeing and hearing these women one after another tell the same version of the story, he describes it like the greatest scientific epiphany he's ever had. It was like, oh, we have a problem here. We need to fix this.
The other thing about it is, the people were different departments, different fields, and the success of these women, and that was the thing about Mary Lou. She was the first one, but still, out of that group, they knew these people were on track to become the next bunch of National Academy members, and they did. And so they knew how good those women were as a group. And when you saw it all together, it had power.
So of the 16 women, 11 are members of the National Academy of Sciences. 4 have won the National Medal of Science. These are not women where you, in any objective way, would look and go, they're really not good enough.
So, Nancy, going back to the moment when Mary Lou signed your letter and you knew you had an ally, what did it feel like when you realized you had allies? It should be noted, some were men along the way, but your biggest allies were the 15 women. What was the impact of that group, and how did it feel to have those allies?
They really were and remained for me the story. And after Mary Lou and I looked at each other and said, you don't suppose there could be more? We went and said, okay, how many more? So we got out a catalog to look at the number of women faculty, tenured. We only want to deal with tenured women faculty in the 6 departments of science at MIT. And there were only, 17 women and 197 men. And so it didn't take very long to find these people. And so we split it into groups. Said, I'll take half, you take half, kind of thing. Off we went to meet with them. And within a few days, everyone we met wanted to join up. I said, do you have something I could sign? So they did become a group. And that was the most important thing. After Mary Lou's initial reaction for me, that was the next most important thing. I became very, very close to these women. And I knew where they were all the time. And I would speak to this one in the morning and that one and late at night. And every day I was talking to them. And we never did anything, took a step without consulting all of them. And everyone had to agree. And I would then write a memo and I'd send it to the dean and say, once we got going, this is what we want to do next. And every woman had to sign off on it. We needed all those people's ideas because they were different fields. And it was the common themes that told the story. And so finding those common themes and making sure everyone was comfortable with it and no one was going to be exposed. And we never talked to people about it. We were operating in secrecy, essentially, so people wouldn't be damaged by people knowing we were doing this. So to this day, I still don't make my decisions without calling some of them up and saying, what do you think I would do about this? They were amazing people, every one of them, pioneers. I mean, everyone.
Yeah, I think, Kate, you once said Nancy couldn't have done it without the group, and the group wouldn't have done it without Nancy.
Absolutely.
So they were just a beautiful marriage there.
Yeah. I mean, I often say that Nancy will say it herself, she's a reluctant feminist, but I think she was also a reluctant leader. But these women wouldn't have come forward without Nancy's determination to do this. And I think Nancy wouldn't have necessarily felt secure in that determination without those women behind her.
Well, and to your point about the women going and telling all the stories at the same time, it certainly wouldn't have worked without a group.
And this
right?
sort of goes to the title of the book. Like, everyone thinks they're the exception. Everyone thinks, oh, this is just happening to me, or, oh, that was just with this one situation. What you have to realize is like, no. This is the rule. This is happening to everybody. And the only way we're going to talk about this is to point that out.
So, Kate, it's been over 2 decades since your first report in 1999. Why did you want to return to Nancy's story today?
Well, again, I thought these women were so ingenious in what they'd done, and they'd really educated me. I think partly when I came back to this story to write it as a book, I was the age Nancy was when she took her magic tape measure and measured these, the lab space and the office space. And so I had seen more and understood, and I think I slightly kicked myself for not having digested it and learned the lesson as a younger reporter. But really, I think I just felt like this was a real learning opportunity and a way to sort of educate people about what we're talking about. How does this work? How does bias work? I started looking into this as a book idea in January of 2018. And we were just coming out of the surge of the Me Too movement. And I was watching the Me Too movement thinking, okay, great, I'm glad that we're addressing these issues, these very egregious issues. I'm sort of amazed it took us this long. But what about the problem that I see happening to so many more women that I think is more stubborn and more insidious because you can't identify it, which is this idea of the unconscious bias and the small ways in which women are marginalized, not allowed to be on the track that men are in terms of career promotion, sort of pushed aside or ignored. And it's not a big aha moment usually. It's really small stuff, but that small stuff adds up. And to me, I was just looking at the world and thinking like, well, that's the problem. Why is no one talking about that? Let's talk about that. Mm-hmm. And again, I thought Nancy was a generous and wonderful vehicle to tell this story through because this really was her life. This is what happened to her.
Absolutely. And when you read the report that Nancy and the other women had put together, what stood out to you and what made you think that this was going to have huge ripple effects beyond the scientific community?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, because my father, who was a physicist, had talked to me about women and the lack of women in physics, I thought like, oh, this kind of appeals to me, right? Like I didn't know, and nor did Nancy or anybody else at MIT, that this was going to rocket around the world the way it did. But I think what I read in the report, I remember a few phrases, and it really was this whole idea of 21st century discrimination, how discrimination works now. It's not the egregious stuff. I mean, there is still some egregious stuff, obviously, as Me Too taught us. But it's the subtle stuff. And it was this idea, I think you had a line in there, Nancy, it was something about they'd open the door, but you were tolerated but not welcomed, or tolerated but not included. And that's really the essence of what happens, right? You open the door to people, but are you accepting them as full citizens?
Nancy, switching to some more recent and very good news, you recently received a prestigious award, the National Academy of Sciences Public Welfare Medal, for your brave leadership over the last 3 decades to help make sure more women have fair opportunities in science. What did it mean to you to receive that award?
I don't know if I can explain it. I was just overwhelmed, honestly. I really was, and still sort of am. And I think there's a couple of reasons I just never thought of it in those terms. I think when you set out to cure cancer, you're going to win the Nobel Prize. You have a goal. This was something I backed into because you couldn't do your work, and it wasn't very popular. And so to have this outcome is hard to even grasp. And I think the other thing is that I realized, after I did this and went back and learned more about women in science, and traveled all over the country giving talks on this report and met all these women, how many women and some men gave their lives to make it possible for women to have a job. If you read the histories from Margaret Rossiter's book, for example, Women in Science, oh my gosh, what it took for women to be allowed to get an advanced degree, to become a faculty member. These, what do we have to have? The civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, Title IX, these monumental social movements about how social change happens. So I feel, yes, the MIT story is amazing, and within science, I think it really had certainly an impact. But I felt, gosh, it's picked it out, this particular thing, as a representative of the work of so many people. Actually, Kate and I went to Washington, and we went through this event, and it was really remarkable. And to join the people who have been given this award are people whose work really did have an impact in changing the world. And I think, when Kate told the story, it had this outcome. I didn't predict it. I wish I could claim credit, but I can't. But hey, it's what happened. Quite a trip.
One of the things that's been kind of heartbreaking for me is in all the time that I was reporting the book, Nancy and I would have these conversations, and I felt like, Nancy, you would constantly be thinking, well, was it really worth doing all this work on the women? Like, was that really that this was sort of somehow second best work? And there was obviously, as there would be, because time is not flexible, there was a cost to your science. And I felt like you really worried about the cost to your science. And so getting this medal, getting the Public Welfare Medal from the National Academy of Sciences, I feel like that was the first time that I heard you fully acknowledge that, oh, yes, this work was important. This was a big deal.
Well, for sure. I mean, that's for sure. I think, and so you realize the thing that you set out to do that was important to you may not be the thing you end up doing that other people think is an important thing you did.
I would say, adding to that you did all the amazing science and this on top of it, right? As amazing science as the men at MIT, and also all this other work.
But I think, this is something we haven't talked about, and maybe we don't need to, but you do pay a price when you do this. Okay, there is a cost. And I think through all the time, I think this is the other reason the medal had such an amazing effect. Through all those years I was doing it, I did it because it had to be done. I ended up in a position where I was the person who had to be doing it. I felt I'm doing something wrong here because so many of my colleagues will never understand it and will always hold it against you at some level. So there's a certain pain associated with it as well, and that will never go away completely. And I understand it. But it had to be done. It has to be done.
Wait, I think say that again. So you were saying you feel like your colleagues held it against you, and so
of course
there was pain associated with, but this kind of took away the pain. Is that what you mean?
It did. It did. I think it really did. We've talked very politely about all of this due to be unconscious bias. The reality is, underlying that bias is a belief that women aren't good enough. That's what it comes down to. At the bottom of it all, that's what drives that belief. So when you stood up against that, people don't, of course, they don't just say, oh, thank you for telling me, now I got it right. No, that's not how it works. No, they still believe it. And so you have to deal with that. But I think that the National Academy did what they did is extraordinary, and extraordinary on the part of the leadership of the Academy and of the committee that did this, because it says it very loud and clear. No, this is the way it really is.
And there was such a, Nancy gave this wonderful talk, and there was such a prolonged standing ovation afterward for her. I mean, I still feel it. It was really incredible. You really got the sense that Nancy had moved this room, and she'd moved the world, really.
Amazing. What a positive note to end on. Well, thank you again, Nancy and Kate, for sharing this amazing story that continues to have such a huge impact.
Thank you.
Terrific.
This has been Lost Women of Science Conversations. This episode was hosted by Juliana Lemure, Laura Eisensee was our producer, and Hans Shi was our sound engineer. Thanks to Jeff Delvisio at our publishing partner Scientific American, and to the team at CDM Sound Studios in New York. And thank you to my co-executive producer Amy Scharf, as well as our senior managing producer Deborah Unger. The episode art was created by Karen Meverak, and Lizzie Unin composes our music. Lexi Attia was our fact-checker. Lost Women of Science is funded in part by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and the Anne Wojcicki Foundation. We're distributed by PRX. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please go to our website, lostwomenofscience.org, and subscribe so you will never miss an episode. That's lostwomenofscience.org. Oh, and do not forget to click on that all-important donate button. I'm Katie Hafner. See you next time.
From PRX.